It's great to be able to welcome you all to the second part of the St. Michael's Spring series, where we are going to be thinking about capitalism and me after the GFC. It's interesting that Jesus said far, far more about money than he ever said about sex or alcohol or dancing, despite my upbringing. And therefore, it's good to have to try and wrestle with the whole subject of money. Christians, by and large, have not always been known as particularly well, some of them have been more inclined to think about those other subjects than about money, and that may be because what Jesus had to say about it is quite hard, and it may be also because the world has got really complex, and how we apply some of our ethical intuitions and learnings to the subjects of global capitalism is hard yakka. So we're very grateful that we have Associate Professor Thirkell-White to guide us through the moral maze of the global financial system. Ben has studied at Cambridge University. He then became an articled lawyer, or is it the right phrase, Ben?
Yeah, I was a solicitor for about 5 days.
A solicitor for 5 days, splendid. Then went off and did a PhD at the University of Leeds, taught in Yorkshire at a couple of different universities, went off to St Andrews, fell in love, and came back to New Zealand, where he is now the aforementioned Associate Professor of International Relations at Victoria. So, Ben, we're thrilled to have you with us, and really look forward to what you have to say tonight. Come on up, give him a round of applause.
Well, thanks very much for coming. It's quite, Tim was sort of thinking of doing this and said, have you got anything you want to talk about? And I sort of felt like I did have something I wanted to talk about, but I wasn't really sure how to explain it, or quite why I was doing it, and so a lot of the process of the talk was kind of trying to work that out. The best I've come up with now is that it's a kind of collective pre-psychoanalysis. Okay, so imagine yourself in Vienna on a nice couch with the soft-spoken analysts. You're very calm. Listen. That's about as far as we go. Only in the sense that what I'm trying to do is bring out some scripts or some stories that are very prominent in our culture about how to make sense of the world. And I'm hoping that some of them you'll be very familiar with and go, oh yeah, we all knew that. And maybe a few of them you may, the idea anyway, is you may kind of go, oh, yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for a few humps. And there'll be different ones for different people. And that's the other reason why I put GFC and me. In the end, this is actually a story about me and how I've dealt with a bunch of stuff that's happened since the global financial crisis came, which is about when I arrived in New Zealand. But I'm hoping that that story will kind of resonate and ring some bells with you, probably different ways for different people, because it's quite sort of socio-cultural stuff, and I think we all experience it a little differently. Okay, but the kinds of scripts, I'm going to suggest that in particular, there's at least a mainstream narrative that comes out of the way we produce stuff, distribute stuff, and relate to work about how we should be in the world. And there's nothing wrong with that narrative. I'm not going to suggest that it's inherently immoral. I'm just going to suggest that sometimes it gets magnified by the system we live in ways that make it maybe more important than it should be. That's probably as far as I want to push it. And the GFC bit, really it talks about capitalism, but the GFC bit's a way of kind of hopefully helping you to see why I think what I'm trying to say might be important. And that's the me story, I guess. You know, I'm a kind of naturally social democratic, slightly left of centre academic, it's probably worth saying, so you know what my biases are before we start. And I thought that, that the global financial crisis would bring us back to a nice 1950s, middle-of-the-road social democratic consensus, and on the whole I think it hasn't. And so that's one of the things that's got, the GFC's kind of got me thinking about some of these kind of values. I guess, for me, one of the questions is, why have so many people that I think are being kind of stuffed over by the capitalist system kind of double down on those stories in the wake of the crisis? And then, so that it doesn't become a, look at those Tea Party people, aren't they funny? I'm adding in that one of the things that also happened during this time was that I had a pretty bad patch at work and found actually that a lot of these narratives that I'm going to talk about were quite a big deal for me, and they were lurking in my psyche and having more weight than I thought they ought to have. You see why I'm talking about psychoanalysis here. So we'll start with a bit of the why it might be interesting to talk about these narratives about how to be that I suggest are quite tied up with capitalism rather than something deeper. And that's about the first half. And then the second half is me kind of getting into, well, what are these narratives that I say are capitalist narratives? Any guesses on the squeaks? Ooh. Okay, so we'll begin with the GFC. And to cut a very long story short, being a nerdy academic with a fondness for banking regulation, I spent a lot of time when the crisis struck and for the next sort of 5 or 6 years looking at the technical stuff about what happened and some nice regulatory things that maybe I would have liked to see come out of that. But over time I felt that it was interesting and I enjoyed it, but it was sort of a waste of effort in that I don't think the political conditions were there for a very significant change in the way, say, financial systems operate. And I think that in terms of ordinary folk, all my detailed stuff about leverage ratios and how much work was going on in the repo markets and all this kind of stuff means absolutely nothing to the vast majority of the population. And so I've kind of got more interested in some of the kind of big blunt messages that came out of this big crisis in the global economy and a big recession. Of course, it wasn't as bad in New Zealand as it was in the US and Europe. And so I think much of what I say is based on those places because there's more research and it's easier to find out, and it's a little bit more moderate here. But I still think we live in the same capitalist system, and some of these kind of stories inside us are still there. So what were the big messages that came out? I went and talked to a bunch of politicians in the UK about banking regulation post-crisis in about sort of 2012 or so. And what politicians said is the real message they were getting from the electorate was they were really angry. They didn't get a message about what to do, they just got a message of anger. Of lots of people feeling really cross that these incredibly rich folk in the banking sector had trashed the global economy, government had then bailed them out generously, while everybody else had paid with their tax dollars, or perhaps worse, paid with their cuts in social spending and that kind of stuff. One of the most visceral ones is the life expectancy has actually declined in the US and the UK since the GFC, largely because of lack of spending on old folk who are now dying a little bit more often than they should. But that's my kind of nice, gritty way of saying that stuff happened. But I think the lessons that came out of it, rather than my hopeful consensus on social democracy, much more political polarisation. Right? We've got a very messy political situation going on all over the place. And about the only thing that I think probably everybody does agree about is that inequality has become a much, much bigger issue than it was prior to the crisis. In the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone was talking about poverty, but they were very studiously not actually talking about inequality, and now they are. In the New Zealand press, Max Rashbrook's been making a big deal of that to try and make us aware of all these things, and there have been some actually quite smart op-eds that say, hang on a second, though, inequality hasn't changed much since 2008, and it hasn't. So it's about an awareness of inequality rather than a huge change in inequality. It's kind of, people were accepting inequality in the hope that it would get better or in the hope that they would climb the ladder, and what seems to have changed is that hope for a lot of people has become much more precarious than this. To say it hasn't changed doesn't mean it isn't an ongoing issue. The easiest places to get figures again, it's places like the US and the UK where there's been long-term wage stagnation for 20 years. People haven't actually got any more purchasing power from about the middle of the income distribution down. And the people who have got richer, nearly all the growth has gone to the top end, not necessarily the 1% in the Occupy whale. We'll get some pictures on that in a second. And in places where people are particularly angry, back in kind of Brexit Trump world, real wages have also not picked up since the crisis. They're slightly lower in the UK than they were in 2008, 10 years on. So there's been people who are a little bit poorer than they were 10 years ago, which is not what we expect in growing economies. In the UK, it's pretty much, in the US, it's pretty much flat. Okay, so this inequality thing, I'm not going to spend ages on the figures because I assume that quite a lot of people are probably reasonably familiar with them, but a couple of quick graphs. This is a classic 1% graph, and don't worry about the numbers or the different countries, it's about 4 or 5 different countries. All that matters is it shows that, so explaining, it's the share of total output that is received as income, it's the share of total income that's received by the top 1% of the income distribution. So, and it begins in 1910, and in 1910 the top 1% were getting about 15 to 25% of what was produced. And then it gets steadily more equal till about 1970. And in 1970 it's between 5 and 15 rather than between 15 and 25. And then it climbed steadily back up again from the kind of neoliberal turn in the 1980s up to today and possibly ongoing. So that's kind of one of the big headline figures, is that income inequality within countries is expanding, and that's global. So on there you've got the US, UK, China, India, South Africa and Argentina all following broadly the same curve. Close to home, this is the wonderful Toby Morris, and what he's got there is a picture of how much of New Zealand's wealth is owned by whom, and the real key bit is the little tiny thin little red bit at the bottom, is the bottom 50% of the population. So that tower represents all the wealth in New Zealand, and half the population is getting that really bit at the bottom. And that has actually got slightly worse between 2015 and 2018. So the column on the left is 2015, and the column on the right is 2018. The other thing that I guess I'd point out is there's a lot of noise about the 1%, but the 1% is that dark green line at the top. I kind of think we should probably at least be talking about the 10%, because that's kind of more people who are actually experiencing the same sort of thing. Numbers don't matter, it's just to give you the idea that inequality really is a big issue. Wealth inequality is worse than income inequality, as you've seen. So this is, the previous one was how much you earn, this one is how much you own. And the story is that poor folk in New Zealand basically own zero or negative assets. So to suggest that there's a real thing going on, and this is the thing that probably most people seem most aware of as something different post-GFC. And here we get to me, and the point I've already kind of made, which is that I was sort of expecting, we academics call it a Polanyi moment. There was a guy called Karl Polanyi who wrote a book in about 1946 that talked about the first era of globalisation up to the kind of 1920s, which was a very liberal, globalised economy, with a strong consensus on kind of laissez-faire economics. And he said that system basically was unsustainable and destroyed itself. And that what comes out of that is a softer, more social democratic kind of welfare state type system in the 50s. And lots of academics, me included, have been busily reading about Polanyi, and along comes a global financial crisis, and they say, whoa, we've finally got to that moment where we've had this globalising pattern, we've had this market-friendly pattern, and now we've got a big crisis, and maybe that will change people's minds. Of course, the last time in the 1920s, there were 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a socialist revolution, the rise of fascism, and a few other rather nasty things in between those two things, right? And so the optimism on the left was that maybe we'd learn to do it better, we had better intellectual tools, and it would be a bit easier because it wasn't so new, to kind of bring back a softer, fluffier version of capitalism. The reality is that what we've got is polarisation, and a bunch of lefties like me thinking that's exactly what we should be doing in the wake of the GFC, and a bunch of other people kind of doubling down on capitalism. Particularly this slide and the next one is drawing on a lot of stuff that I've read about the Tea Party in the US, because they're really well researched. And lots of people by now have gone and interviewed Tea Party folk and found out what makes them tick and what they're into and what they believe in. So. And also some kind of lefty academic literature. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if a sort of conspiracy version of the story that says, well, banks are really powerful, finance is really powerful. We had a big crisis and finance was so powerful that nothing changed. But my take on Britain, particularly where I did quite a lot of research, is that isn't really what happened. It was general populations too who weren't, yelling down the houses with a very clear agenda for how they'd like things to be different. There wasn't a huge upswell of support for left-wing tax and spendy kind of policy or that kind of thing. And so it's not just elite capture that's going on, but it's also something more about kind of cultural attachment to capitalism. So there's a nice book by a kind of neo-Marxist based in Sydney called Martin Collins, which is all about the emotional appeal of capitalism, and he tries to unpack the kinds of needs that some stories about capitalism fulfill for people, which is where we're going with psychoanalytic need. So just to kind of, it's not like, so there was some conservative commentary coming out that said, well, what we learned in the global financial crisis was that it was all about consumerism and a sense of entitlement and debt addiction, and popular anger is because that rug was pulled out from underneath people. And that was particularly a story you got in the UK after the big riots in London, where a lot of people were stealing stuff out of stores, consumer goods and things. And I wouldn't say that wasn't part of the story, But I think a more interesting part of the story, and you'll get all the way through this, like, this will be critical of capitalism, but I'm not going to talk so much about greed and self-interest. I'm not saying those aren't a thing, I'm just saying they're a bit obvious, so I'm not going to talk about them. And I'm more interested in kind of capitalist virtues, in the things that we think are actually good behaviour, and a suggestion that it's a lot of, that there was a narrative of good behaviour that's been hit very hard by this crisis. And that some of the kind of right-wing popular reaction is about challenges to these kind of set of instructions for how to be in the world. So I would suggest that a lot of people believed that the way our system works is that if you do everything right, you ought to be okay and you ought to get rewarded for that. And that people did actually believe that the system would do that for them. That capitalism was okay because it did reward hard work, and it did reward talent, and it did reward prudence and, what have we got, independence, hard work, honesty, frugality, self-purification through discipline, which is pushing it a little bit towards the kind of flagellation side, suggests it might be problematic. But, you know, these are all good values that I don't particularly have, you know, most of us, I think, would see are ethically good. But I think a lot of people in America thought they'd been doing all that, and they got stuffed anyway. And I think that's a lot of the root of the anger for people. That the American dream, well, particularly talk because it's the Tea Parties I know about, has been kind of stolen. And at least amongst Tea Party folk, you get the story that, as I say, that kind of doubles down on the American dream. I think this is where I get a little bit psychoanalytic. I think people are so invested in that story that this is the kind of society we live in, that this is how it's supposed to work, that you work hard and you save your money and you don't spend frivolously and you do kind of all the good things, and then that will give you the rewards that society offers, particularly material ones, I guess. That when that all went wrong, they were happier, they didn't want to reject the system because the story was too important. That's my suggestion for a lot of people. And of course that's a bit of a lefty suggestion because I'm suggesting, yeah, but certainly what you get from Tea Party folk is a very rigid, very kind of all-encompassing attachment to that kind of vision. So there's a lot of talk about the free market being kind of part of American heritage and something that's enshrined by the Founding Fathers in the Constitution. It's something kind of bigger than the government of the day. And that system has been broken by liberal elites messing with the market. So the story for the Tea Party is that what went wrong prior to the GFC was that all this kind of strange fluffy leftiness, that's the snowflake stuff, as Trump folk call it, that crept into America was kind of what was breaking the system. People weren't being rugged, self-regarding folk. There was all this affirmative action and all sorts of other things that were, and too much government, that was stopping capitalism from operating the way it should. So the problem with the GFC was that capitalism wasn't being capitalism enough. And to me that can only really make sense if you're pretty darned attached to this vision, which I personally think is, you know, kind of a little bit deluded in the first place. And my suggestion is that the doubling down creates a lot of the anger. I suggest that this creates a lot of insecurity for people who've had this strong belief about how the world works, what they should be doing. The GFC stuff puts it under threat, and they double down, but probably some part of them is also worried about that story and quite defensive about it. I think some at least of the kind of anger that comes out of you know, the nasty stuff that goes with Trump politics can be seen as trying to repel attacks on that deeply held model. So people point out that opposition to feminism amongst Tea Party folk comes around to a lot of narratives about breadwinners and masculinity and providing for your family, and that comes under threat. If your belief that your masculinity is about being a breadwinner, doing all those things I've talked about properly, and then getting the rewards from the capitalist system, when you worry about whether that's really how the system works, then your ability to be a man is threatened. And if you hear lots of feminist narratives at the same time, maybe you find those hard to take because your manhood is already threatened by kind of capitalist crisis. Likewise, one of the problems with narratives of race and white privilege is that a lot of these white people don't feel very privileged in the wake of a financial crisis in 30 years in which their incomes haven't increased. And so they find it particularly hard to stomach stories about white privilege, and particularly stories about how, you know, this sort of self-madeness white American men was not as self-made as it appeared. You know, you can see how narratives of slavery and white privilege and discrimination against black people are threatening to that self-image and that kind of vision of oneself as the person who deserves to exist in the world because they're independent and hardworking and have won what they deserve by fair means, if you like. In a sense, feminism and race are both attacks on that idea that that white middle class existence was fairly acquired by doing what you do, which is working hard and achieving the fair rewards that come from that. So I guess my suggestion is that the GFC has made people anxious about a particular script, about how it is that one should be in capitalist modernity, and that anxiety has created some quite defensive reactions around some narratives that threaten that. I'm sure there's more going on. There's a long history of race relations in the US. There's a long history of patriarchy everywhere. So I don't want to be too super strong about that, but I'm suggesting it was possibly a factor. And we'll leave the last line because... Okay, and so there's the beginnings of our kind of Tea Party vision of how... and presumably it's also broadly a Brexit vision. Again, it will come out differently. So the Tea Party story has a particular American cultural slant to it, but there are echoes of it and there are similarities in other places, I guess. And you can only cover so much in however many minutes you have, which I'm already going over. So we shall move swiftly on. And the bit where we get away from, you know, that one of the difficulties in our contemporary political culture is polarisation, and I kind of don't want to too much vilify people. I would rather actually look for reasons for a bit of compassion. And my suggestion is that you know, there's a lot of fragility and pain in what's going on out there. A lot of people are feeling who they are as being thwacked. And that's politically important, because if you respond by telling them they're idiots and racists, that may be true, but it's not going to be particularly productive in kind of getting through the place we find ourselves in, I guess. And so to sort of humanise that in a sense, this is the moment where I kind of introduce my own mini-crisis. And the same period while I'm in New Zealand, I get jobs at the department, I have 2 small children, and my department always has too many students and not enough staff because we're too popular, and it's been really stressful. And I particularly found for myself, the bits of this narrative that came out to me was just how important work is. How much of my feeling of what my duties are in life and what my obligations are in life are tied up with work, and I found it extremely difficult to do things badly at work in the interests of having a young family that I spend time with. In a way that a rational part of me said, my kids to me are more important if you ask me to fill out a survey, but some emotional part of me had this very deeply drummed in commitment to work that made that very hard choice. And then in that struggle, work wasn't going enormously well, because I didn't quite have enough time for everything. And my academics is all about research output, and I didn't produce anything for about 4 years. Partly because I was depressed about all this stuff and didn't know what to write anymore, and partly because of other things. And again, that hit me really hard. I'm always a bit depressed, but I had a really good bout of clinical depression through this. And again, that to me was that as I started to be a failure at work, which I wasn't really anyway, but I felt like I was, that to me was being a failure as a human being. And I'm not sure you all feel like that, but the fact that I did was quite revealing to me that at least some of these stories about capitalism are quite powerful in at least some people's lives, certainly mine. And I'm going to suggest now, this is going to be too small for you to read, but that's okay, it'll remind me what to say. I want to kind of unpack some of these stories, and I want to unpack how they are. I've kind of suggested that they're connected with capitalism. And this is much more my kind of academic stuff. My honours course always starts with a session called Capitalism and the Social. And it's all about how much social lives changed in the 18th century as capitalism appeared. What we do to earn money and make things and distribute things is very, very different from the rest of human history. It's not completely different, it's not a radical departure, but it is really different in the last 200 years. And a quick gestural way, and my suggestion is that some of that anxiety comes from it's different and it's complicated, and it is genuinely difficult to understand our place in the world, because we live in a very highly complex society. We're very aware of that complexity, and we're very we'll talk about alienation in a moment. And I suggest that some of those difficulties in making sense of complex societies make us attracted to nice, simple narratives, like the capitalist one. Don't worry about all the complexity and mess and what your relationships are with this and what the demand system is over there and how African people are selling agricultural products and all that kind of stuff. It's too complicated. Just work hard in your calling and you'll get rewards. Nice, simple, ethical script. So what are these complications? Well, a simple way to think of it is, and it's a bit of a stereotype, but if you imagine tradition as small-scale village life with a subsistence economy, where people basically make stuff because they need it. They might trade a bit with their buddies who are better at some things and less good at others, but most of what you do is you make stuff because you need it and then you consume it. And the contrast with the system by the mid-19th century in England, by the mid-19th century, everybody goes out to make money and they use the money to buy stuff. And the stuff that they buy might be produced by goodness knows whom, goodness knows where. So we go from producing a wide range of stuff and spending a lot of our productive lives producing stuff that we actually need, to doing something that earns us money that we use to buy the stuff that we need. And it separates out relationships between production and consumption, and between work and reward, and between kind of creativity and consumption, maybe depending on your job. It also, as it happens for the feminist in me, creates a much greater separation between going out to work in the public sphere and being at home in domestic life. In the village, your farm is your house is your farm, it's all kind of connected, and there isn't that kind of big separation between private life and public life. And that again gets really big sharpening with the arrival of capitalism. The CMC MCN is Marx, and it's just a summary of what I was saying before, really. CMC is commodity, money, commodity. You make commodities, you make stuff, and that's your primary focus, and you might sell a bit of it, market it, and then consume what you've swapped with your buddy. You know, you might swap your corn for somebody else's peanut butter in the village. The MCM one says that you start with how do I make money? And then you get involved with commodities, and then you use that to make more money. And so money making becomes a kind of activity in itself that's divorced from production to some extent. People who are good at business think in that way. It doesn't really matter what I'm making. I'm so good at business that I'll make money, and what I'm good at is spotting money-making opportunities as a kind of. And there's not, again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but what I am suggesting is that it's quite different, and that it complicates our relationships between what we do and what we consume, and it also complicates our relationships with one another because everything operates on a much larger scale, and in particular, the bits at the bottom are about changing social relationships, and there's a really good aspect to those and a really bad aspect to those. What happens with the Enlightenment and the rise of capitalism is that nepotism gets a good clobbering, and we're encouraged to buy stuff from the person that will sell it to us cheaper, regardless of who they are, what their race is, what their gender is, whether we met them before or not. Good stuff about that is it's egalitarian. It gets rid of lots of structures of heredity and stuff that were really problematic. The bad thing is that it creates a whole load of our lives where the most rational thing to do in market terms is to really ignore the person completely, and to really focus on economic value. And I think, so the good bit of that is that it gets rid of some nasty social relationships. The bad bit is that it tends to be corrosive of social relationships in general, I would say. And again, I don't want to put that too strongly. I'm not saying we can't have friends. I'm not saying we don't sometimes choose to do business with our friends. But as a tendency and as a kind of encouragement, there's more. The system becomes isolated. We become more of a cog in it. We do our little thing, and we don't really understand how most of the rest of our needs are met. And as a result, our relationship to other people in society is much less transparent than it might have been at a small-scale level. And some of it's just about population and urbanisation, but it's also about how the economics work. There's a lot about achieving and planning. Again, from the 17th, 18th century, we get much better at controlling our social world and controlling the natural environment, and we begin to expect to be able to plan, organise, make decisions, think ahead, have the future in mind. And then if you do all that stuff, you'll be rewarded and you'll deserve it. And for modern secular folk, I would suggest that that's a big part of the message of what they're supposed to be doing in this world. I don't know whether other people would agree with that, but that's certainly the message I feel like I've received through my life. And some sort of gestures at why that, just breaking that down a little bit, a suggestion that production and accumulation can become kind of almost a moral goal in itself. How's your son doing? How's your grandson doing? My grandmother would ask. And she was a bit of a snob and a bit right-wing. But what she absolutely meant is how much are they earning? And I'm not sure that's what everybody would mean, but it may be quite often what they mean. And that's attractive in some ways. I see it in myself. I think the measurability of money does give you a sense of status, a sense of success, a sense of achievement that can be quite nice. There's no harm in that. We all need that. And in fact, part of my point is that we all need that. And therefore, these things are tempting to take hold of us a bit more than they should. Because we need to feel that we're doing well, and that we're being successful, and that we're contributing and we're achieving. You know, these are good things. It's just when they get a bit skewed and kind of too important. And a lot of people's identity and self-importance comes from their career. My best illustration of that is the kind of agonising, I'm only a housewife, or I'm a housewife, under kind of occupation category on Facebook. It's really difficult. And that suggests that there are some funny narratives going on there about what makes you a valid, interesting human being, I guess. And again, not to say that careers can't do that, just that maybe we overdo it. Self-discipline and self-reliance, there's an awful lot of that, particularly in the kind of Tea Party world. But there's a lot of strong discourse about responsibility, that one of the things capitalism does is it teaches us that we take the consequences of what we do, that we have to work hard because only people who work hard deserve, that people who don't have, probably it's because they don't deserve, because they didn't work hard, that kind of stuff. And for some people, it can also be, a replacement for back to God being dead. Part of Weber's conversation was that we're not very clear about what our ends are in the world anymore. Modernity has become too complicated, we don't agree what the good life is. And sometimes I think capitalist success can do that. You can feel that you're contributing to society, or doing your bit, or earning your way, or creating wealth, or providing employment, all those kinds of things can be a way of feeling self-worth in a less specifically career kind of a way. So that would be my very sketchy thing about what the good person does in a capitalist society. And it's fine, it's just that there are bits missing, and it's a bit fragile, and it's unachievable for a bunch of people is one of the things I think I'd say, and it's maybe quite a big kind of GFC outcome. The links between unemployment and mental health, for example, are pretty strong, because all that goes into reverse if you're not managing to pull it off, I guess. And I would suggest, and it's that kind of narrative that I would suggest is kind of like, if that's been your credo and how you've lived your life and how you've believed everything operates, when something like a financial crisis comes and it makes you wonder whether any of that's true, it can be quite difficult to deal with, I guess. And even, and for other people, even if you are succeeding, some of those things can become an iron cage rather than a part of our lives. Bit crude, but I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to spend ages on this. This was just a gesture to acknowledge that, like, capitalism hasn't been the same since the 18th century, and that's a bit simple. The main thing, two things that I suppose are supposed to go, and it suggests that things have varied over time, culture's varied, the way it works varied. 19th century, very austere, hard-working, save. I would say over time there's probably more emphasis on creativity and invention and innovation and those kinds of things in what a good capitalist is. The bit at the end is just a bit of a gesture at now, which again is a story of better and worse. And I'd say the better thing about some of the kind of new economy, digital media-y type stuff is that it has the potential to use more of us, to use our emotions. Marketing is all about emotional connections these days. Networking is really important in business, which is a sort of personality attribute kind of thing. To suggest that this sort of austere, working your guts out kind of 19th century vision, we've got something a bit fluffier and more attractive. And the good side of that is that there's more scope to use more of your humanity to earn money, I suppose, and more to succeed within my narrative. The bad side is more of us risk getting captured by that as well. So, the stuff about what happens to your 15-year-old Facebook page when you apply for a job and people start looking at it. And the idea that employers now want you not just to be hardworking and reasonably bright, but also have an outgoing personality that's good for networking with clients and be media savvy and be wearing the right clothes. And, there's a sense in which perhaps as more of you can go into your work, so work can take more of you, would be my kind of rough suggestion for that bit. So what does all that mean? Well, back to the thing about the psychoanalysis. I don't know. I think that's a question. The psychoanalytic metaphor was to say that mostly all I'm doing is going to leave you with all of that, to go home and meditate on it, and ask yourself, are there places in my life where those stories are stronger and more powerful than they should be, where they're messing with other views that I have from other places that maybe I should try and grow and kind of devote more attention to, I guess. And that'll be different for lots of you. These things have more attraction. I'm a very goody-goody sort of person. I think that's part of my problem with the capitalism thing. I've always done what I'm supposed to. And so maybe I'm particular, with a kind of Christian audience, there may be quite a few people like that in here, right, who are susceptible to these narratives of how one should behave, and therefore it might be particularly good to ask which ones they should really be buying, which are eternal or which are a product of the last 200 years, and which may be held a bit lightly. I gestured in the intro that, in the abstract that Tim sent out, that one reason for thinking about this is the GFC and the idea that there's a lot of pain and anger out there, and I sort of feel like maybe one way through it in the medium to long term would maybe be to find a better way of talking about how we should be in the world, and that wasn't so kind of polarising and didn't press on people's anxious buttons in ways that created toxic results. Which is why I kind of start off with yelling at the trumpet ain't going to fix the problem, and the suggestion that if these are fragile people whose sense of self is suffering, then yelling at them, telling them they're idiots and they ought to read more Keynes is maybe not the way to deal with that kind of a problem. I also think, not really in the talk, but climate change is obviously an issue hovering around all of this. If much of our self-worth is tied up in not just in consumption, which, sure, but also in producing and success in the market economy. How do we live in an economy that is compatible with a sustainable planet? Likewise, all the literature about robots taking our jobs. If that's actually true, if robots really are going to take our jobs, and there's lots of that in the media, then that whole system's going to come crashing down, because it's built on scarcity and competition and on who produces what. If production becomes largely costless in the hands of people who own the super clever robots, then we're all going to have to think again about what our society looks like and how it works. So I think there are a bunch of reasons in the distance for thinking through this stuff a little bit more. How do we hold, at a personal level, less a political level, how might we hold these scripts lightly? Well, I said this is a bit kind of self-helpy psychoanalytic. I found a very old self-help book. It's probably a bit hard to read here, but it says, there is nothing better for a woman than she should eat and drink and find enjoyment in her toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? It's Ecclesiastes, for those that don't know. And also, she who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with gain. This also is vanity or mere breath or a chasing after the wind, depending on, I like the chasing after the wind, which is the King James translation. But the suggestion there is that all this stuff is kind of a bit less important than we think it is, and that we should chill. At least that's kind of the way I read it, because there's stuff that's bigger than this, and for Christians in the room, that's God. Even for non-Christians in the room, there's probably stuff that's bigger than this, actually, and it's worth us spending time thinking about what that stuff is and kind of trying to grow it, because so many social messages, I would say, kind of push it down. And then the other bit I sort of wondered about, so I've said, we need to make something nicer and warmer to the Trumps so they can get over their narcissistic disorders, which is kind of where it gets in the psychoanalytic literature. Well, what would that look like? And the best I've kind of come up with there is the idea that maybe, so a crisis hasn't changed people's attraction to capitalism, at least not enough for there to be political change. Where else might it come from? And I wonder whether there might be scope for, Max Weber in his petrification, he overdoes it a bit. There's space within capitalism to do interesting and different things that might rely a bit more on those non-financial variables. So, Wellington with its love of social enterprise, anything from that right through to kind of really hippie co-op world. I mean, I wonder whether there's space for trying to find other ways to live that rebalance our values a little bit, kind of round the edge of capitalism with the hope that those will be appealing and attractive. and might eventually, kind of encourage people out of their double down on capitalism misery as they try to do something that they can't do and doesn't work anyway. And that's probably all there is to time for. That's very gestural. If you want to ask me some more questions about that, do feel free. Likewise, if you're disappointed with not enough technical stuff about what actually happened during the GFC, I can do that if anyone wants to know. Otherwise, I shall leave you there.
And really kind of helpful. Some quite good career affirming things there for me, I found.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a place for vicars in this life.
You're in there. A lot of the stuff my source for the bit at the end that I didn't really have time to do is one of my wife's really cool MA students has been sort of wandering around Wellington trying to find people that she describes as having real utopias or concrete utopias that they're trying to kind of produce. Matt Bartlett's brother is on the list of her interviewees, actually, Richard. And one of the things that comes out of what all four of them who are quite different say, there's an awful emphasis on connection, on time to really treat people as people, and kind of emotional exchange, and the idea that that gets crowded out by norms of professionalism and by just busyness otherwise. Anyway, but that's obviously
I'm really busy. I thought we might just turn to our neighbour really quickly and just frame for them a question. Share with your neighbour the question that you would like to ask, just to sharpen your thoughts, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. So 1 minute to sharpen your question with your neighbour, and then 20 minutes to ask them an answer.
I've seen a lot of articles in the last week or so saying 10 years on, we're coming to another GFC, so what do we do now?
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to call that stuff, isn't it? The nice one, I've seen a really good long Bloomberg kind of 10 years on one that looks at bank balance sheets and the repo market and all that stuff. And what's clear is that banks are notably safer than they were, but not radically different. So, you can be glass half full, you can be glass half empty. If I was going to be glass half empty, I'd be quite worried about Chinese banks, particularly. And it's difficult to judge. So one of the things that drives those crises are cycles of what great book, 1960-something, guy called Charles Kindleberger called Mania, Panic and Crash. It's such a great summary for what happens in financial crisis, right? So people become more and more confident over time because it's such a long time since anything bad happened. And you get to the top, and then for a while people are nervy. It's hard to know, right, whether people are just nervous or whether there's a problem. The stuff that suggests a problem is, big bumps in asset prices, not big bumps in incomes, not a great deal of productivity increase, and that doesn't sound fabulous. Well, the more crises, the more chance of change, I suppose, or the more chance of really hideous, yucky stuff. I'm not feeling deeply. I think there are reasons to be nervy. In New Zealand, it's what happens to house prices as they begin to decline in Auckland, and what that does to the New Zealand banks. But it's probably all right. In the short term. People are still making stuff and producing stuff and eating stuff. The world hasn't radically changed. It's just that there's this frothy financial instability kind of floating around.
I think a lot of us here probably thought there needs to be a change.
Yeah. And would some more crises make that happen?
It's not just put my money in a safer bank, it's socially orientated stuff.
Yeah. It's very hard to know where all of this is going. It's still actually quite soon in the grand scheme of social change, which is a slow process, I suppose. And the inequality awareness is a positive sign, I think, at least.
I'm wondering what you would say is the role of the state in this.
Yeah. What I would say is a bit more state. I think that crisis was a crisis of banking regulation. That's the easiest. If you asked me what was the most fundamental thing that was wrong, it was that banks were under-regulated and they weren't holding enough safe capital, and states had got too excited about globalisation and competing for capital, and they'd forgotten the risk that goes with that. And I would also suggest that, one of the particular problems in America is that the American states always struggle to really assert a social role. There was the New Deal moment in the 1930s, but it was pretty brief and it was much more fragile, whereas in parts of Europe there's a bit more of a tradition to build on there of the state. I mean, like I'm a dangerously state-fanish kind of a person, and my utopian vision of the state is as a place that can be the centre for social coordination. That it's a really, there are economies of scale in doing stuff like welfare through the state, and that, ideally we would come together and darn well tell our state that we want to be a bit nicer to each other and pay a bit more tax and have a bit more social investment as a result of that. That's my personal utopia. But as I've said, at the moment, I think politics is taking that in two very different directions. One reaction to feeling like you're the squeezed middle class is to say, I don't want the state to take any more taxes because I'm already struggling and I haven't had any bonus for the last 20 years. You can see how that might lead you to be very anxious about a bigger state. I think I understand the logic of some of that feeling.
Next question.
How do you think this narrative and this thinking has affected forms or places of connection and community that have existed or currently exist, such as church or family or other places?
Yeah, I mean, that stuff it's so big and it's so difficult to measure. So there was old Robert Putnam who did stuff about social capital that tried to kind of measure how much people were going to the bowling club and going to the kindy. I mean, at the moment in my life, surrounded by young children, I'm very aware of how difficult small childcare centres that run 5 hours a day are finding it. And in my personal life, I feel like social stuff is really big time squeezed out by a combination of work and quite atomised ways of dealing with family. But I don't, how can you measure that? I don't know. Hard to say on a big general scale. I mean, you can see how if you bought a real strong version of that narrative, that what matters is work and productivity in work and the stuff that flows from that, that's not going to be great for community organisations. But I don't think most people are that far down the line, right? I think it's a narrative that competes with others for most people. But I certainly think that, all the happiness literature that says that you get a much bigger... the happiness literature, there are a bunch of economists who measure happiness by basically asking people, are you happy? And they do it in a very systematic way, and they ask people quite regularly, different groups of people in different places. And at least in terms of answering that are you happy question reasonably affirmatively, reasonably reliably, the amount that you get from going to church, being in a sporting club, pretty similar as it happens. Depressing for the vicars of this world, but actually playing rugby and being in church are pretty similar on your happiness bump. But those things are real good happiness bumps. And certainly over about $39,000 US a head, you start not getting much more happy for much more money. It's quite good research, which is lower than a lot of people think.
What about if you go to church twice?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. And there is also your soul, of course, not just whether you tick happy on a happy survey. But as a kind of rough indicator that on the whole, I think. And I kind of keep wanting to emphasise that it's not just consumerism, it's also that kind of sense of success that you get from work. I think we overdo relative to other places where we might get happiness and fulfilment. Easy to say for somebody who's relatively wealthy and feels like they could, would happily work less and get paid less. Obviously that's different for some people, but for some assumptions about a Kelburn audience.
Question on the front here.
We have what I would say is a growing climate crisis. We're increasingly seeing changes in our weather patterns around the world. We're also potentially might head into another oil crisis and so on. Now, large sections of the community are in denial about these things and are just going on as if nothing's wrong. And of course, if these things happen, they're going to crash the economy like nothing else ever did. And any comments on that?
Yeah, as my philosopher colleague says, I'm a climate change pessimist. I'm very worried that our kind of collective social learning will be too slow. I mean, I think, so if we could find these ways to be happy that were a bit less tied to material stuff and producing things, that would obviously help, because it would reduce the demand for material stuff, and basically the more things you make, whether you do it through solar energy or you do it through oil, in the end, if you're making stuff, you're using energy, and there's a limited supply of energy in the end. I mean, I'm not too worried about oil prices, because I think oil is gradually on the way out. It's still important, but it's gradually on the way out. And you know, sure, if and there's enough of it in enough different places. But the climate thing is obviously a biting constraint, and it's a kind of a question of how fast. You know, the pain is a bit late in the game, isn't it, with climate change? A lot of the problem is that we're really going to feel it at a point where it's really hard to do something about it, and to get people to dramatically change their behaviour when they aren't even really feeling it, and they're feeling stressed, and they're feeling anxious, and they already feel like they're struggling. I'm not hugely optimistic, frankly. The optimistic side of me remembers how much I used to recycle when I was a child, and things have changed, and things do change in terms of attitudes to that stuff. There's way more awareness, but it's a hell of a lot more behaviour change needs to happen from the awareness right before we can be comfortable about it.
Question over here. Yeah, hi. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting watching the 2016 election was if you looked at places like West Virginia, you had people who were coal miners and then had generations and generations of coal miners. And the thing you've got to remember about coal mining is it's very hard, dangerous, dirty work. And really, why would you want to be a coal miner if the left generally, to put in general terms, was offering things like transition programs or maybe some sort of welfare solution? How would you explain as to why people, when given these alternatives, and it perhaps maybe because they didn't necessarily trust that they were going to get looked after through these alternatives, that may be a thing. But why would people want to fall back on hard, dangerous, dirty work that was obviously unsustainable? When there were alternatives. I find it really fascinating.
Yeah, and very much part of my childhood, right? As growing up in Britain in the 80s, when the miners' strike was just a huge part of the culture, and if I turned on TV any night when I was about 10, there'd be huge lines of police in riot shields, basically in a full-on brawl with large quantities of miners. I mean, I think one of the things that's like the danger of academia that says capitalism did this and everything changed, it's quite clear that we don't fully behave as we should, right? If the coal miners were really good capitalists in a sense, and the only thing was economic value, then they wouldn't care. And in practice, we're more complicated than that. And it seems to me that being a miner particularly if it's food for generations, it becomes part of people's identity. So I think one of the things is that jobs and identity are quite tied up. And again, that can be good and bad. I mean, it can be something that takes you away from money, but it can also be something that means you get particularly hard hit if your job gets threatened. The other thing about mining is that they tend to be towns that were completely built around that industry. So if the mines change, it's not just your job, it's also possibly your community dies, or if it doesn't, it's radically transformed. So it is your entire life. And I think again, political economists can still make this stuff more important than it is. That's partly why I backed off a bit at the end and sort of had my Ecclesiastes and God's speaking and stuff. So all I've got really is that it's what people are used to. They're afraid of change, and like you say, probably they don't trust the programs. It has to be said that the third way left didn't do a great job of backing up its claims about retraining people and getting them into jobs, and it didn't work very well in a lot of places. So there's some really good research on how long it took. So standard economic models say we shouldn't have trade protectionism because what happens when mining dies is that you think of losing mining, but all the miners and all the capital that was invested in that get redeployed to do something else that's more efficient. And so that the overall losses in the medium term aren't as big as you think they are when you see the mining industry die because of trade liberalisation. But economic models assumed that people would be re-employed really, really quickly, and when they calculated the cost of trade-driven displacement, they assumed that it would be a couple of years before somebody found a new job at the most, and that would be as much productivity as lost. But when they researched places that, in that kind of Rust Belt in the US, places that have been really badly hit by Chinese competition in manufacturing, they found that it took people 10, 20 years to get another job. And that actually the costs of that, the process of moving from one thing to another thing was much, much harder than standard assumptions assumed it would be for whatever reason. So yeah, partly it's community, partly it's always more than money, partly it's about identity, and partly, like you say, a lot of those promises aren't to be trusted, and the money doesn't get spent on dealing with the pain from trade, if you like.
Very much time for one more question.
I still kind of believe in trade, by the way. I just think you really should really work hard at those things.
Thank you very much for the great lecture. The question I have is, how much of the rise of cyber world has an effect on individual level and state level? Because I was reading the defense white paper of New Zealand in 2016, and most of it was protecting the cyber infrastructure and the exclusive economic zone. Of course, that's due to the rise of China, South China Sea conflict, geopolitical interests, and global economy, and the US election, etc. So would it be fair to say that the states, with the rise of global cyber security, they have to shift their focus, and that have a very huge impact on the individual and social level? So what's your opinion on that one?
Yeah, I still think the cybersecurity thing is a little bit high B. There's a lot of money to be made as a cybersecurity consultant. There are a lot of publications to be made because it's new and doesn't. Having said that, there's something real there. I don't really know. I mean, because the valuation that people put on huge data resources, so the part of Facebook's valuation is based on what they think Facebook's data is worth. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's a huge amount of cash. I suspect and that data will turn out to be not as useful as people imagine it is, and therefore I'm slightly less worried about people nicking it. Having said that, who knows? There clearly are nasty things. At the moment, a lot of what goes down as cyber problems are kind of irritants. They're annoying, they're stunty, they're a little bit costly in financial terms, but it's hard to point to real big disasters to date. But there remains presumably the possibility of trashing up traffic systems and dams and critical infrastructure and stuff. So, at the moment, I'm a bit sceptical, but I don't really know what I'm talking about from kind of a way. But I suspect that nobody else does either. So when I'm in an optimistic academic mode, I don't admit that bit and just say, oh, I don't think it's as bad as people say. But in terms of, how our addiction to our machines affects all this other stuff, clearly there are overlaps with the kind of social atomization and difficulty with connecting with people and all that kind of stuff. It's another thing that can fuel some of those problems, says the laptop addicted academic, who rather likes, there's a bit of me, I'm an academic because I can sit in my office for a great deal of time and not have to talk to another human, and I can use my computer to, it's good for introverts. Anyway, but probably not good for connection.
Thanks, Ben. Let's give Ben a round of applause for that really stimulating